Hello, and welcome to Humanities Matter, brought to you by Brill. I'm Lee Chung Greco, and this week we'll be looking at key issues in the field of humanities.
Today we're speaking with Henrik Edgren. He's Associate Professor at the University of Uppsala, Sweden, and Merete Roos, Professor of History at the University of Southeastern Norway. Their article is Exploring Textbooks and Cultural Change in Nordic Education from 1536 to 2020. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have three other editors that contributed to this piece as well, if you'd like to introduce them.
Yes, I could do that. It's Kjell Lars Berge, who is a professor at the University of Oslo in Norway. And it's Christina Mathisen, who's an associate professor at Copenhagen University in Denmark. And it's Pirjo Hiidenmaa, who is a professor at Helsinki University in Finland. And they were unfortunately not able to be present with us today. So Henrik and I are representing the editorial team.
Well, excited to still have the conversation today with the two of you. First off, tell us, what's the aim of this volume? Why did you track the history of textbooks all the way back to the 16th century for this piece?
Well, I could start. As you said, the overall objective of the book is to highlight in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland how textbooks reflect national, cultural, politics, and legislation from the 16th century up until today. And you know why we start so early as the 16th century is due to the introduction of the Reformation, not only in the Nordic countries but all over Europe. And this had a major significance for not only for how the church and religion was organized, but also for how education was organized in different perspectives.
Yeah, I can continue with some comments on that, and it's perfectly right what Henrik is saying. But it's also important to take notice that the Nordic countries are very often mentioned together, and we are kind of tracing their common roots back to the Reformation, because the Reformation in the Nordic countries took on a different color or a different aspects in the Nordic countries than in rest of Europe. So our aim is to trace a line from the Reformation and up to today. And it's, of course, the Reformation and the Church have a great significance in this history.
Yeah, I think also it's important to stress why we are looking into the Nordic countries, and that is in our case Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland. There is a major common historical heritage, of course, but there are also some important differences between the countries. And in that way, it's quite interesting and constructive to look into the uniquenesses of every country as well as similarities. So this is why this region is so interesting to have as the research object, so to speak. So
I might comment upon that again, and it's also important for us to show non-Nordic readers that it is like Henrik says, that there are differences between the Nordic countries, because many think of the Nordic countries as a united union or a united region. So it's important for us to show both the similarities as well as the differences.
Yeah, and that leads me into my next question, what was the effect of the Reformation on education? You mentioned that it differed so much from the West, but I'd also like you to touch on how it had a different effect in each Nordic country, because as you mentioned, it's not all just one block that we seem to lump it into.
Well, I can start with that question, because this must be seen in in light of the complex history of the Nordic region, because Norway and Denmark was one country from the late 13th century and until 1814. The Reformation had a different impact on Denmark, Norway than what it had in Sweden. But what is common to the countries is that it had a great impact on reading skills and writing skills.
So really fascinating fact then. You focused on three main questions in your article here. You asked, to what extent is governmental control reflected in your material? To what extent is participation from the public reflected in your material? And then who are represented in the contents and didactics of the empirical material? What do each of these questions illustrate about Nordic society and education?
Well, I could perhaps start with the first perspective about government control and how that is reflected in historical textbook materials. I would say that as I said, from the 16th century, there was really an intention of control from first of course from the church, and then also from the state, in the meaning that they really decided and control the contents of the textbooks, so that the contents should really be of the right. They should teach all the people in the society how they should act, and what were the important values, and in a matter of also controlling the population of these states. So I mean, the government control is really important. I would say from the beginning until at least the middle half of the 20th century. And then, of course, this has changed. It has been variations, but government control is really crucial from the beginning, I would say.
Yeah, and that leads us to the representation keyword, because the representation can be seen as a parallel to the control keyword, because in the beginning, right after the Reformation, who is represented in the textbook is in fact the church and theology, and the main goal for the textbook editors and the school system is to educate people into being believers and into being Christians and good moral citizens. And when you go towards our own time in the Enlightenment, there's more, and the books are more and more increasingly more secularized, and the independent and individual human is represented in a much more clear way the longer you turn toward our own time. So I would say that the representation is slowly it's going in a slow progress from being represented by the church and increasingly to secularized and to the humans.
Yeah, and I would like to add there that Merete is, of course, totally right when she's stressing the importance of the church in the 16th, 17th, 8th, and 18th century. And it's also important to say that in the 19th century, especially from the 1850s, the state, the state of Sweden, the state of Denmark, the state of so on and so forth, they got more involved in not only in textbooks, but in financing and in organizing schools, and the states got also more involved in taking control over the whole society. So the state involved itself in many other areas as well, and you can see this also when we look into the textbooks and how the state progressively is more and more interested in so to speak governing the contents of the books and financing the contents of the books and paying authors to write these textbooks, which were spread all over all over the countries, to all pupils going in the elementary schools and so on and so forth. So the state really put enormous resources in writing these and publishing and financing these textbooks. And this is an important shift compared to how it was before that, I would say.
Yeah, and it's also, if I may comment on that, it's also very strongly related to the development of the national states, because around 1850s, 50, as Henrik says, the state takes over the control over the textbooks, and but it also has an educational project to teach the individuals to become good citizens within the national state, and from this moment you can also see that the different textbooks function as nation building tools, if I could say so.
Yeah, and to put it simply, you could say that in the 19th century there is a shift from, if you look in a general way on the contents of the textbooks, you can see that in the beginning of the 19th century there is this old tradition of teaching subjects who really should be having focus just to obey authorities, obey the king, obey the church, obey God, and so on and so forth. But the longer we come into the 19th century, there is more of a teaching of citizens with more of a national way of looking into things. So they should be more scholarized in how to live in a constitutional society. They should be taking more responsibility over their lives. It was more of a kind of individualistic view of the person. So I mean, this is a major historical change all over Europe in the 19th century. But it's interesting that you can also see this noted in the contents of the textbook during these 100 years, I would say.
You mentioned those different shifts. You have the shift during the Enlightenment when textbooks became more secular, and then you have that shift again in the 1850s when you said that government gained control over textbooks more. I'm wondering, though, again, as you noted before, Nordic countries are not this one block. So I'm wondering how each of those shifts played out differently in each country, if you can touch on that at all.
I would say that if you look into this aspect, if you look into how the state took more responsibility and how the state was more involved in schools and in textbooks and in the contents of textbooks, I would say it's quite similar in the Nordic countries as well as in other European countries in the same time. If you look at what happened in Prussia, if you look at what happened in France, if you look at what happened in the UK, you have the same kind of, UK was a little bit later, but anyhow, you see the same kind of development. So this is really, this shift from the second half of the 19th century, where the state got more involved in school systems and took more responsibility. I would say this is a very interesting and international history, I would say.
Yeah, I totally agree with Henrik on this topic, and I think that these changes must be seen in an international context, and that the differences are more on perhaps more in the 20th century you will see differences, and because these changes can be seen in light of multinational impulses, with secularization, with big historical events or revolutions that goes throughout Europe. So I think that Henrik is perfectly right in mentioning that, or in saying that this is an incident, or this is a fact that we don't see much differences between the Nordic countries. It can really be seen in the context of international impulses.
But On the other hand, if you look into if we talk about nationalism, for instance, in this area, and nationalism, the ideology of nationalism, where there is this big effort of building, imagining communities. That's the word of Benedict Anderson, where all the people in one country should learn their own importance of their own history, their own language, their most important writers, and their geography, and the wonderfulness of everything that was in Sweden and Norway and Finland and so on and so forth. This is a general development. But if you look into how nationalism, was used in these countries, there are of course differences. If you look at Norway and compare it to Sweden, for instance, Norway and Sweden was in a union in this time, and the Norwegian nationalism was very much focused on to make Norway to become an independent country, an independent state. So in that sense, the liberal parties in Norway, they use nationalism as a tool to have arguments to getting rid of the union with Sweden. In Sweden, on the other hand, nationalism was used in a more conservative way, where the aim was to, so to speak, keep Norway in the union. So here we have, of course, major differences in how nationalism was used and the contents of nationalism between the different countries. And in Denmark, on the other hand, we have the kind of classical and conflict with the southern states of Denmark, with Schleswig and Holstein, where there is this conflict between kind of German influenced nationalists from Prussia conflicting with the Danish nationalists. So here we have, of course, differences as well. But in general, the overall development was very similar in the Nordic countries, I would say.
I just want to say that the differences should be seen in the context of the history of the countries, and because there has been a tension between the Nordic countries regarding political history, and as Henrik also mentions, Denmark and Schleswig-Holstein, and the union between Norway and Sweden, which lasted from 1814 to 1905, and so there are differences, but in the way you asked about, the similarities are stronger than the differences.
And that all really answers my last question, which was, talking about the growth of nationalism in the 19th and early 20th century and how that was reflected in textbooks. I am curious, though, the way that you describe nationalism as reflected in the textbooks, it seems more positive. It seems like learning authors and sort of taking pride in one's country versus the more negative connotations that we now associate with nationalism. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that at all. Were there other shades to this sort of nationalism that was coming up?
No, it's a very important question. Of course, in many perspectives, there was this positive way of describing your own culture, your own language, the wonderful history with the heroic kings and adventurers and great authors and so on and so forth. But in these countries there were also other ethnic groups that were not really included in this nationalistic narrative, so to speak. For instance, in both Sweden and Norway, we have the indigenous people living in the north called the Sami people. They were not included in this construction of the imagined community of the Swedish and Norwegian nation at all. So yes, obviously there was this, as we see today, it was some groups were of course included, but other ethnic groups were not included, so here we have the same kind of contents of the nationalism as we have today.
I think there is a very thin line between the negative and the positive side, because on the positive side, the nationalistic aspect tries to include or to strengthen the national feeling, but at the same time, the strengthening of national feeling involves or includes that some of the nation's group, like the indigenous, like the Sami population, is not included in this concept at all. So I think that the very thin line between the positive and the negative side should be underlined here.
I think it's also important to remember how nationalism, not only in the Nordic countries but everywhere, as perhaps they also in many countries of the world, were used as a way of building loyalties to the power. So this was a way of saying to the people living in a state that we have many things in common, we have a proud history, we have a wonderful language, and you are included in that. And this means also that you have to be loyal to the government and to the people who are governing the country. So you have this aspect of power of the nationalism and how it was used, not at least how it was used. That is very crucial and important to remember when we are discussing, the huge impact of nationalism during this time of European and especially European history, I would say, in the second half of the 19th century.
Henrik and Merita, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Henrik Edgren, he's associate professor at the University of Uppsala, Sweden, and Merita Ruus, she's professor of history at the University of Southeastern Norway. Their article is Exploring Textbooks and Cultural Exchange in Nordic Education from 1536 to 2020.
You are listening to the Humanities Matter podcast. You can find more podcast episodes on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast.